Time to begin the meeting of the Metropolitan Council. Today is Wednesday, August 8th, 2018, and I call the meeting to order. The first order of business is the approval of the agenda. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. The next order of business is the approval of the minutes from our July 25th meeting. Can I have a motion to approve those?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. The next item on the agenda at this point, members of the public who wish to address the council on matters not on the agenda may do so, but I would just ask you to limit your comments to 3 minutes. I don't see anyone signed up. Is there anyone that wishes to address the council? Seeing none, then we'll move on to the reports of the standing committees. We don't have a consent agenda today, so we'll move right into community development. Councilmember Munt.
Madam Chair, committee members, this action is to amend the City of Minneapolis's comprehensive plan. The proposed amendment removes 9.44 acres from the Southeast Minneapolis Industrial Employment District. The amendment re-guides the property from industrial to transitional industrial, and the amendment is associated with a two-phased redevelopment that may include up to 800 dwelling units and 80,000 square feet of commercial space. The staff found that the proposed amendment conforms with regional system plans, including the Transportation Policy Plan requirements for the density near transit. It does not impact potential future alignment of the Grand Round's missing link. It underscores the need for the council and city to develop adjusted forecasts for the 2040 comprehensive plan update. It is otherwise consistent with the council policies, and it's compatible with the plans of adjacent and affected jurisdictions. Therefore, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council, number one, adopt the attached review record and allow the City of Minneapolis to place the Malcolm Yards Comprehensive Plan Amendment into effect. Advise the city to work with the council to determine an updated forecast for its 2040 comprehensive plan update that incorporates stronger than forecasted market demand and changes in guiding land use. Advise the city that the council requires the incorporation of density ranges into its land use policy to determine conformance and consistency with Thrive MSP 2040, the 2040 Transportation Policy Plan, and the 2040 Housing Policy Plan. And finally, to advise the city to implement the additional advisory comments in the review record for forecast, land use, and housing.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. Next, we move on to the Environment Committee. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The business item 2018-200 is a request for closure of the 2016-2017 Sewer Availability Task Force. The purpose of the task force was to evaluate and make recommendations to simplify the fair and equitable collection of SAC fees in the metropolitan area. The task force included officials from metro cities, city officials from a variety of backgrounds, private sector representatives from across the region, and we met 8 times throughout 2016 and 2017. The recommendations are summarized in a task force report distributed prior to this meeting to all council members, with copies available to the public outside the chambers. Attachment A of the business item contains an executive summary of the report. The recommendations were shared with the business community and our customer communities for further feedback and input through multiple outreach meetings throughout the first quarter of 2018, and were accepted at the March 21st, 2018 council meeting and went into effect on July 1st, 2018. The task force did a fantastic job, and now their work is done. So therefore, I move that the Metropolitan Council accept the report of the 2016-2017 SAC Task Force, discharge the task force, and thank them for their work and input.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Support.
Any discussion? Member Bork.
I think this was important work. I did not serve on this task force, but I want to thank my colleagues who did and acknowledge Ned's leadership on this as well, Ned Smith.
Excellent. Any other discussion? I would also just echo those thanks. I want to thank Councilmember Wolf for your participation on it. I think if you look at attachment A on page 4, you can see the list of folks that dedicated their time and effort in addition to staff for a very positive outcome for our region. I just want to make sure that we thanked everyone. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. Next, we move on to the Management Committee. Councilmember Chavez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we're going to have a presentation by Mickey Gutzman about an interesting extension or enhancement for the MCUB expansion program.
Excellent. Welcome.
Chair, council members, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Elaine Ogilvie. I'm an equal opportunity consultant with the small business programs at the council.
And my name is Mickey Gutzman, Director of Procurement for the Metropolitan Council.
And obviously, I'm not Aaron Koski, but I will be presenting on the MCUB expansion on his behalf today. To give you some background, let's see, I think this is probably my best view. Give you some background on the MCUB program. In 2012, the original MCUB program was established in response to Governor Dayton's directive to increase business opportunities for women, minority, and disabled-owned firms. Council Policy 3-4-6 provides MCUB framework for increasing this participation, and this applies to non-federally funded procurements only. MCUB primarily applies to locally funded construction, or it did apply to locally funded construction contracts that had subcontracting opportunities. The MCUB expansion program, phase 1, expanded the goal-setting opportunities to not only construction, but also professional technical and architecture and engineering contracts as well. In phase 1, we began to create a process to collect and record our inclusion efforts of our grantees. And we also refined an approach to identifying and reporting MCUB spend that the council does. We increased our outreach activities with external outreach events, and we also participated in the joint disparity study. The disparity studies are conducted to provide legal foundation for government race and gender-based inclusion programs such as MCUB. In 2017, the disparity study results for the Metropolitan Council showed that the disparities of women and minority-owned businesses still exist, and specifically there were substantial disparities in the direct procurements of goods and services with MCUB firms. You will see this is the disparity numbers for the Metropolitan Council in the following procurement categories. I just want to give a little bit of explanation on what these numbers mean. Availability is the availability amount of all minority and women businesses in this particular category, certified in small business or non-certified. The utilization is what the Met Council actually utilized of these firms, and the disparity index shows the difference between the two. The disparity index of 80 or less means that there is a disparity between what we utilized and what was available in the market. The ideal number for this disparity index would be 100. That means that we would utilize 100% of what was available in the market. With the disparity, the consultant that performed the disparity study made several recommendations to the Metropolitan Council to increase our minority and women participation. OEO and procurement have considered what the recommendations were, and we are proposing the following MCUB program and policy changes to those recommendations. We are considering these recommendations to be phase 2 of the MCUB expansion of the program. The first would be to increase direct spend with MCUB firms. This would be in the form of what is known as a sheltered market procurement process. And we'll go into that in a little bit more detail on the next slide. We're also going to propose that we increase the pool of MCUB firms to now recognize the City of St. Paul certification, the CERT certification. Just as a backup, some backup information, MCUB, we currently accept targeted group businesses, disadvantaged businesses, and veteran-owned businesses, and this would just increase it to accept another certification. The third area where we would like to focus our attention is increasing access to capacity building resources, which means we're going to again increase our outreach, which we have started already, providing more networking opportunities for these small firms, and we are working on an enhancement to our doing business portion of our website. I'm going to let Mickey speak a little bit about the sheltered market program, which we are titling MCUB Select.
The sheltered market program, if you're not familiar with those terms, in this case, it's going to be applicable to non-federally funded goods and service procurements under $100,000. Okay, which means that over $50,000, generally over $25,000, the procurement staff are involved in those procurements, and under that dollar amount, the end user can go ahead and initiate the procurement, get the quotes or bids or whatever, and then pass them on to us. We collect them still, so we'll still have an eye or a view on them. It will apply when at least 3 MCUB vendors have been identified that could do the work and who have basically gone through a orientation class of sorts with OEO to deem them responsive and responsible so they know what they're getting into, meaning they might need insurance or they may have to file a lobbying certification or something to that event so that they know what's going on. And we will only solicit these to 3 firms that are MCUBs, which means that no matter what the bid amount is, whoever is in the pool will get it, one of the 3 vendors, because they will already be an MCUB vendor. So we know that we can't not have an MCUB vendor when we come out of it as a successful bidder or proposer. They will only be able to stay in the program for awarded 3 successful projects, totaling at $200,000, whichever comes first. Okay, and that will be, we will do that and we'll track it in conjunction with OEO by feeding them information. What we're doing.
Okay, so recognizing the CERT certification, adding that to our already existing MCUB directory pool. So currently we have a total of about 1,870, and that fluctuates from month to month, obviously. Currently in our MCUB directory, and again, that's a combination of DBE, TGB, and there are a few disabled firms in there as well, approximately about 17 right now. So in looking at adding the CERT certification, with CERT, what we would be doing, CERT currently is small business enterprises, and of those small business enterprises, they have the opportunity to be certified as a woman-owned small business enterprise or a minority-owned small business enterprise. The Met Council, we are proposing that we accept only the minority and the woman-owned business enterprises. That would add an additional just over 900 firms to our already existing directory, making a total of over 2,000 firms. So what we are looking at with this is increasing the amount of firms, but also increasing the areas of work for which these firms can potentially provide. So possibly increasing the pool of what we're looking at for goods and services.
Oh, Councilmember Ledowski.
Thank you. Could you explain the difference between the CERT ones and the MCUB ones? I would assume there would be some overlap there.
Absolutely.
The way your diagram shows it, there's not any overlap.
Chair, council members, so there is no overlap. Currently, the CERT program has approximately, it's over 2,000 firms. So the 900 that we would be adding are firms that are not already certified DBE, TGB, or VET. So these are individual unique firms that we would be adding that are not already certified as MCUB. Is that?
Thank you.
Okay. 3 of them up there.
So a planned approach to these newly suggested changes would be on July 25th, we submitted this presentation to the management committee. We are proposing that in August, we prepare for the MCUB Select program. We expand the directory to include the certified and disabled firms. By September, we're hoping to identify applicable procurements. And by October, we are hoping to execute full implementation of MCUB Select.
Great. Do you want to read the motion first, and then we can have any discussion?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Management Committee moves adoption of the matter as far as resolution for expanding the MCUB program to include a sheltered market model described in the staff presentation as MCUB Select. And that will apply to non-federally funded goods and services, procurements under $100,000. It'll apply when at least 3 MCUB firms are eligible, available, and capable of performing the scope of work. They must already be within MCUB and have successfully completed program orientation. They will be eligible, they will remain eligible until they have been awarded and successfully completed projects totaling $200,000 or 3 individual projects, whichever occurs first. And then to increase the pool of eligible MCUB firms to include the City of St. Paul's certification and disabled firms.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion or questions on this item? Member Wolf?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Typically, the broader your bidding pool, the lower the prices turn out. I mean, in a perfect world anyway. What are we doing to make sure that by limiting that bidding pool, we're not driving up prices beyond what it would otherwise have been?
Madam Chair, and members of the council, good question. It is one of the things that we are a little concerned about. Sorry.
I can see you, that's fine.
A little bit concerned about. But one of the things that procurement does is when we're checking responsiveness and responsibility, because they still have to meet those criteria when they bid, is we look at what happened last time and what we expect it to cost, what the market is doing. We may see some inflation of pricing because these are smaller vendors, and so they don't have the economy of scale that a bigger vendor might have. But we will be able to make those decisions as we go if it's too much of a difference, or if it's within the 10% range, which is usually our range if it's higher than 10% of what we expect it to be. But those decisions will still be made on a procurement by procurement basis, just as they are now with any criterion. But we will track that as well to see if it's way out or on market or.
Thank you.
Member Cunningham?
Yeah, Madam Chair, there was a graph on my presentation on the disparity study results. Do you have that? Can we put that up? Because I think it's important for us to really look at what we're trying to address. When staff brought this to the committee, we didn't have this information in front of us. And if you look at it, you look at goods, for example, we had, for women and minority businesses, on the right-hand side, a utilization of 0.99, less than 1%, and availability of 16.72. So this shows that there's folks in the market that can provide these goods that, for whatever reason, our system hasn't allowed them to be party to that. And therefore, we talk about equity, we talk about all these issues, but these are millions of dollars that really should have, if not for discrimination or other procedural issues in our, and this is what the report actually says, without other kind of procedural issues that are in the way, that people, if everything was equal, we'd be at that 16.72%. And if we're going to really focus on, my concern about what we're doing, and I voted for this, is not that this is bad, but is it enough, right? Meaning, when are we going to get to the level where women and people of color and people with disabilities, for that matter, actually are uh, uh, fully a part of our system and not 1.1% or less in our goods and services. 2 years ago, we actually worked on this and expanded this program, and I haven't seen the results of that at this point. So I'm very concerned that that the remedy that we're putting on the table won't get us to curing the problem that we have. And so I'd like to ask staff, do they think what we're doing now will get us to parity with regards to participation by women and people of color?
Madam Chair, members of the council, you're looking at me, so I'm going to answer you. The direct eye contact thing. Do I think it's going to be enough? No, I don't. Not to get us to 16.72%. But what it will do, which has never been done, is in procurement, in the world of procurement, we never pay attention or look at who you are. We look at your company. So basically, when a person comes to bid or propose, they are nameless and faceless. They are raceless. They are colorless. And it's not because we're trying to ignore it, it's just never been part of the criterion. It's never been something that procurement historically has looked at as part of the criteria. So what this will do is open our eyes, and I'm talking about the procurement people, my staff, basically. We, like in our database right now, we don't track who's a minority vendor. That's something that OEO does, and so we don't have it readily at our fingertips. So when I look at a vendor record, I can't tell what nationality you are, or where you come from, or if you're a minority-owned business or not. Like, my people cannot see that. We're working on changing some of those things in our infrastructure to be able to do that, so we know who we're picking and what we're doing. And so it is enlightening a lot of people and showing when we do this this market change, the way that we're doing with the sheltered market, I think that it will help us start to learn those things of who those individuals are. There's also the other thing that concerns me is there's not a lot of transactions in this dollar amount between $5,000 and $100,000. In the course of a year, there's only like 2,000 of them. And I couldn't say off the top of my head if all 2,000 of them are going to fall into an area where a sheltered market program would even fit for them. Or if an MCUP would even be able to be available for everything that we buy, because the Metropolitan Council is so diverse in its spend that we have things that are so specialized that we're having trouble finding vendors, period, that supply them, let alone people in MCUP pool. So it worries me. I want to, as much as you probably, maybe even more, because it's something I've been working on for so long, move the needle a whole lot more than I'm afraid we're going to move it. As these guys know, I'm continually trying to push the needle. So I think that it will give us some awareness we haven't had before in what we are capable, and maybe even highlight some ideas we haven't even seen yet on how to move it further.
Madam Chair, if I could just follow up
Member
on
Cunningham.
that. Thank you for that. And this isn't personal to staff or anything like that. There's some structural things going on here that maintain what is. And my concern is I thought we had put in place some expansion of the income program into goods and services over a year and a half ago. And so for you to say to me today that we haven't looked at those identifying markers of race and sex and gender and disability as a part of what you're doing, it's a little surprising to me. So I'm a little concerned that, we've actually said we're going to do something, and I'm not sure if anything has happened to date around that, the
Madam
profile of
Chair,
who we're serving and why.
Madam Chair, members of the council, yes, we're speaking about two different things. Yes, there's been an MCUP expansion. We've done a lot of work, a lot of outreach. We've done it in conjunction with OEO on those sorts of things. But when it comes down to what I'm speaking of is the actual transactional we get 3 bids and they come in on paper, either like hard copy paper or they come in electronically. And my staff collects 3 and we go lowest price is, and they circle it. At that moment in time, I have no idea if those 3 people, because it's coming from, it would be coming from like a gtsmrt@gmail.com email. I don't even know who they are at that point in time. So that's what I'm talking about, is not knowing who they are. So now we're going to have them actually identify on some of those things, not just a company name, but we'll be able to cross-reference with OEO if they are one of these sheltered markets or sheltered vendors in a disadvantaged vendor in that market. So we're actually taking it to the next phase, basically, is we're actually going to start saying, who is this associated with? And is it part of a DBE? Is it an MCUP? So we're taking it to the next level, is what we're taking it to.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Sure. Member Elkins.
Just a quick question. Do these numbers reflect subcontractors or just direct contractors?
Both.
Both. Okay.
And
Member
again,
Dorfman.
these are certified and non-certified firms.
Member Dorfman.
So what efforts do we make to divvy up big contracts so smaller firms can be competitive?
Madam Chair, members of the council, one of the things we do from a procurement perspective is we unbundle things as much as we can, okay? So that if we see that there's some components, if at all possible, we can take out surveying, for instance, and have it be its own contract. We will do that. We call that unbundling, to be able to target and get people moving and not just have one prime, but have several primes. And so that's what we do in our world. And
Chair, council members, same thing. We will look at a contract, and if we see that there may be opportunities for that goal setting piece, we definitely will set a goal. The phase 1 of MCUB expansion expanded it from just construction to professional, technical, and engineering, and we've seen significant results from that. And I can provide some numbers on that at a later date, but that has been very successful. I know there were at least 3 of these contracts that I set goals on where they were awarded to an MCUB firm, not just subcontracting. So that's a huge win. I will say that I completely agree with Ms. Gutzman in the fact that this is not going to get us to parity, but it is something. It is a start. And with being able to manage some data tracking and procurement tracking, getting that on paper and getting those numbers out there is going to raise awareness not only internally but externally as well. And we're going to be able to more clearly see what areas we truly need to focus more attention to. I think we have a really good idea right now, but it's not enough. I will say that sheltered market is what I consider a bold move, but it shows our dedication to this effort. I do not think at this time that there are any other agencies in Minnesota, state agencies or city, that have implemented a sheltered market program. So we will be at the cutting edge of this and hopefully set a good example for the rest of the industries.
I think from my perspective, it would be helpful if we have a sense of how we're going to be evaluating the success of this. I mean, I think you just talked a little bit about the data components of it, but how frequently are we going to be looking at that data to see if we need to make adjustments over time? Is that quarterly, every 6 months? I'd like to see kind of follow up on what the proposal is on reporting.
Chair, council members, so at the management committee, we had a suggestion from Councilman Cunningham to report back on a regular basis, and we made the commitment that it would be quarterly.
Okay, thank you. Any other discussion on this item? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. Thank you. We will move next to transportation. Councilmember Rodriguez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. 2018-197 deals with an annual agreement with the Minnesota Department of Transportation for calendar year 2019 that will provide MnDOT's 8.05% funding for public commuter rail service in Sherburne County, Minnesota, for calendar year 2019. I therefore move, Madam Chair, that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to enter into an agreement with the State of Minnesota Department of Transportation for calendar year 2019 to provide funding for public commuter rail service in Sherburne County, Minnesota for an amount up to $1.5 million. Execute the attached resolution of the governing body to enter into an agreement with the State of Minnesota Department of Transportation.
Second the motion, Madam.
Thank you. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? The motion is adopted. So next we'll move on to other business. The first information item we have is 2017 population estimates. And that is going to be presented by Matt Schroer, if I pronounced your last name correctly.
Schroeder, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, council members. Handouts are coming around. I will make sure that Ms. Getty gets these tomorrow to distribute them electronically too. So yes, I am Matt Schroeder from the research unit here at the council, and I'm here to give you an overview of our 2017 population estimates, which I admit might seem like not the best reason to be inside on this beautiful afternoon, but I assure you I will not be reading down this list of numbers that you're receiving right now. The purpose of this presentation is not to dig into the details of the estimates, but to talk about the broader trends that they point to and what they might mean for the future of our region's housing market. So in that light, this kind of follows in a long line of presentations that you've engaged in, the regional growth strategies conversations that some of you have been involved in, the presentation that we gave to the Community Development Committee in early June entitled We Need More Housing. And so this title is We Have More People Who Need Housing. So focusing on the implications of population growth for the housing market. I am up here myself because I oversee the council's estimates program, but I do want to acknowledge the contributions of people without whom this, throughout the division, without whom this presentation wouldn't exist. So especially my fellow researchers, Deb Conley, Joel Nias, and Kristen Ryder-Turres, and our manager, Joel Hutting. Before I begin, though, I do want to make a couple conceptual distinctions. One is that estimates are different from forecasts. They're frequently confused. So estimates are where we're looking at the best available and most current data we can, and on the basis of that, trying to say something about what the recent past, in this case 2017. And forecasts are where we're looking ahead to coming decades. The most current forecast is for 2040. Not with a crystal ball, but with a computer model and the input of local communities, and trying to figure out what the population will look like in 2040. But to focus us, estimates are about, in this case, 2017, the recent past, what has already happened. We do these because under Minnesota law, ours are the official state government population estimates used for allocating certain forms of funding, such as local government aid, local street aid, and other forms. We know that local governments have their own uses, such as determining how many liquor licenses to distribute, or even ordering new population figures for their road signs. But internally here at the council, they help us track growth and development. They're the inputs, they're the basis of other varieties of estimates that we produce, which I'll talk more about later. They help us do consistency checks on our forecasts, and they're also kind of an intuitively understandable way to talk about the intersection of all these trends we hear about in the news: council policies, local policies, the housing market, developers and residential preferences and demographic trends, and all these things coming together to produce different patterns of population growth and change. So that's what we're really focusing on today. And to look at first at the overall estimates, you can see that as of 2017, we're estimating that our population is approaching 3.1 million, though not there yet. We should be there probably by now, but certainly for the 2018 estimates, this will probably be above 3.1 million. That's an increase of 226,000 people from 2010, good for a 7.9% growth rate. So a more healthy clip than we were growing in the past decade between 2000 and 2010. And when we talk about how the population is growing, it's natural to think that we must be getting a lot of people moving here from elsewhere in the country. And actually, 2/3 of that growth, of that 226,000 people, comes from just the fact that more people are being born than are dying. The remaining 1/3 comes from migration, primarily though from outside the country. But it's important to keep in mind that even if no one were moving into or out of the region, our population would still be growing. And this map shows where those 226,000 people have gone. So obviously Minneapolis and St. Paul in the center of the map jump out. They've captured more than a quarter of the net growth of the region since 2010. But the main point I want to make about this map is the relatively balanced nature of the growth. So every county in our region has multiple communities that have grown by at least 1,000 people. So growth is strong in the core, which is another reversal from the past decade, but again, it is occurring in a balanced fashion across the region. We also look at growth rates. So here, darker shades of purple indicate communities with a higher growth rate since 2010, which is higher in the, you'll notice, in the edge of the community, the suburban edge, emerging suburban edge communities, which makes intuitive sense. They're starting from a smaller base, so the percent increase tends to be higher. But that's exactly why we want to look at this, because we know that whereas adding a few hundred people to Minneapolis or St. Paul wouldn't make much of a difference in the big scheme of things, to a place like Medina or Wayzata or Lilydale, it's a lot more noticeable because these places tend to be smaller. So this kind of gets more at the what you might call like the felt sense of change and what it feels like on the ground, which could well feel more rapid than it would in a larger community.
Madam Chair, if I could ask a question.
Councilmember Cunningham.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a question about the increase from 20 to 81.9%. That seems like a big range. And so I'm just wondering, there's a lot of gradation in there or maybe not. So why that large range between 20 and 81%? As which, because, I'm trying to say, well, is there some that were 50 or 40 or?
Mm-hmm.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham, thanks for the question. My recollection is that the 81.9% is for Fort Snelling, which has added a lot of, I believe, housing for homeless veterans, although people who know better should feel free to jump in and correct me. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the spread is like, although I think that was a pretty clear outlier and that most communities are below 40%.
Okay,
But I'd be happy
that's
to-
really what I was trying to get at is, so that 81.9, Madam Chair, is really an outlier from what the rest of the region is growing. Because if you just looked at it, you'd think, oh, wow, 81.9, without that explanation, I wouldn't really understood that.
Thank you. And we can also use a different variety of estimates that we develop. These are for transportation analysis zones designed to align with our community estimates that we've been talking about to look at the growth rate in certain areas of different cities. So this map shows Minneapolis and St. Paul, which shows that most areas in these two cities are experiencing growth. Although much of that has occurred in the downtown areas, as well as along transit corridors like the Green Line and the Blue Line. So overall, though, most areas of Minneapolis and St. Paul are growing. Looking at some suburban edge communities, in contrast, growth has been a bit more concentrated. So Maple Grove, Plymouth, Lakeville, in this example, are all growing as a community, but that growth has kind of been more concentrated in certain pockets, and there are more yellow areas on the maps showing areas where there's been no change or decline since 2010. So again, these communities are growing just a little more unevenly than Minneapolis or St. Paul on the basis of our estimates. Along the way to calculating our estimates, we also develop a couple of characteristics that are important in their own right because they show the trends that our housing market is responding to. And those two are average household sizes and vacancy rates. I'll talk about average household sizes first. So over the long term, since 1970, when the average household had about 3.2 people, our households have gotten smaller, obviously. So our current estimate for average household size is around 2.5, basically unchanged from 2010 or even 2000. But over the long term, households are smaller than they were in the 70s when much of our housing stock was being developed. But despite the small change in average household size since 2010, if we drill down into smaller categories, we can start to see the continuation of trends that we've been talking about as a region for several years now. So this chart breaks it down into households of one person, two person, and so on up to six or more people. And what this shows is a general shift, slow and gradual, but definitely noticeable, a shift from 3, 4, and 5-person households toward the 1 and 2-person households as a share of the region's household mix. So again, this helps us see that households do continue to get smaller, even though it doesn't necessarily show up in the average.
Madam Chair.
Please, Member Rodriguez, sorry.
That's okay. Since I'm about to be an empty nester, how do they count when your kids are in college? Is that, are we counted as a 2-person household or a 4-person household? Just curious.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Rodriguez, the official Census Bureau residence rules state that kids in college are to be counted at where they attend college. So if they're living in student housing or an apartment near the college, that is where they're counted. But if they live primarily at home and attending school, then they would be counted in at their usual place of residence.
Madam Chair, I have a question that's kind of related. So if you looked at communities of color and indigenous populations, would this be a different story, or is this just the general story that's going on? Because what I hear from educators is that the school populations are exploding with children of color, and that many of the housing developers that are affordable housing developers are saying they need to build homes with 3 and 4 bedrooms, et cetera. So I'm just wondering how that plays out in this variation, and given the shift in the demographics, it would seem like this may not hold for a long time as a trend.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham, thank you. That actually is a great segue into the point that another point that I wanted to make about this slide, which is that you can see that the share of our households with 6 or more people, these larger households, hasn't really changed that much since 2000. And in fact, within this larger household size category, they seem to be getting larger. So more and more people in this among these larger households, which, as we stated in our housing policy plan, is an important segment of the market that we really shouldn't overlook, especially as we get more immigrant families arriving to the region who prefer multi-generational living arrangements. So despite the fact that our housing market really is picking up on this trend towards smaller households and building a lot of studios and 1-bedroom homes, there is an important segment of our market that doesn't get as much attention. Those larger households that also need options, and especially affordable options, in a range of options, and so they can satisfy their preferences as much as anyone else. Councilmember Cunningham, did that answer your question?
It did. I just one, thank you for that. The second part of my question is if we have a demographic shift going on as we predicted, and you may not be able to answer this now, at some point this will shift, given what you just said about immigrant families and families of color really have a larger households. So that's really the question, is how does this compare with our projections in the 2040 or estimates, I should say, in the 2040 document.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Cunningham, this is broadly consistent with the direction that we have been forecasting. Whether the observed trends so far are consistent with the magnitude of that shift, I don't have at my fingertips, though because this does come from the most recent 5-year period of the American Community Survey, this is this would not be completely up to date. The 2012 to 2016 period is 2 to 6 years older than we are now. So the second characteristic that we developed that I want to highlight for most of the rest of this presentation is vacancy rates, which have dropped since 2010. So from 5.8% in 2010 to an estimate of 4.0% now. And what this amounts to is 19,500 fewer vacancies across the region. So that even as we have more households who are looking for vacant homes to accommodate them, we have fewer of those vacant homes. Which is something that we need to obviously pay attention to as a region. We can also look at a different data source from the Census Bureau for the full metropolitan area to look at the trend over time. And so even though we don't tend to look at the absolute levels in this specific data source, the trend is really illuminating, I think, because over this 31-year period from 1986 to 2017, you can see that on the right side of this graph, the vacancy rates that we're experiencing now are some of the lowest that we've had over the past 3 decades. So again, giving a broader timescale to this general pattern that vacancy rates are quite low. Looking at this, how this plays out across the region, we're showing here transportation analysis zones where the vacancy rate dropped by at least half between 2010 and 2017. So for example, from 6% to 3% or less. So these are the zones where the vacancy rate is dropping fastest. And the main takeaway here is that this is not an issue that one community or a few communities are facing in isolation. This is really a region-wide issue. So most cities and townships, and most cities at least, do have these areas where the vacancy rate is dropping quite rapidly.
Member Dorfman, sorry.
What do we know about whether families are aging in place or if they tend to be downsizing? And we have all these baby boomers, which is partly why the household size certainly has reduced. Are they staying in their homes that they raise their kids in, which could be available for larger immigrant families, multi-generational families, or are they staying put?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Dorfman, that too is not something I have at my fingertips, but it is something that we can look into.
My neighbor, the answer is yes.
Yeah.
Both.
Well, if I could just, it's a little bit because of the increase in housing costs. So, I mean, I have a house where I raised 5 kids, that my mortgage now, and I don't need those bedrooms, but my mortgage now is lower than I could get if I found an apartment, even so.
Yes. Thank you for the point, Councilmember Dorfman. That's consistent with what I've heard has been happening too. That is as it's become harder to find homes for sale, since the supply of homes on the market is so low now, that presents an additional challenge, even independent of the financial side of things.
Madam Chair, not to
Member
overindulge,
Cunningham.
but this data is fascinating. I'm just wondering, is there any real patterns besides saying that this is happening all over the region? Are there other patterns to these orange blotches that might be indicative of something? So are there areas along transit corridors where this is happening more, or are these just random? I don't think they're random. I actually think there's something to this pattern that's occurring here and where vacancy rates are dropping, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a question that I have. But it's more an academic question, so it's not something you need to spend a lot of time on. But the question of what is the pattern and how is it occurring might be helpful in terms of what policies then would we develop to address the issue, as a part of it. Otherwise, you're just kind of saying, oh, it's happening, that kind of thing.
Yes. Thank you for the point, Councilmember Cunningham. We do plan to do a more in-depth examination of vacancy rates later this year, and
Okay.
we'll certainly add that to the list of things we're looking at.
Great.
But the main reason we're talking about vacancy rates is that because of their relationship to housing costs. So as there are fewer homes available to accommodate the households who need housing, as the demand for housing starts to get larger than the supply, landlords have more leeway to raise rents, sellers have more leeway to list their homes for more, and housing costs tend to increase. So what we've shown here is only for the multifamily rental market. And this goes back to basically immediately after the end of the Great Recession, starting in the third quarter of 2009, showing that the vacancy rate has dropped considerably over that time, and for the past few years has been below 5%. So the shaded zone there is below 5%, which is kind of generally accepted as what's called a healthy vacancy rate, which is one where rents, in this case, are basically rising with inflation. So there's no no additional upward pressure on rents. But what we can see as this vacancy rate has been below 5% is that rents have started to increase at a faster pace over the past several years. And the question here, as I mentioned, is to what extent rents are starting to outpace inflation. And so if we add the inflation on here, you can see that as in these past few years, as the vacancy rate has been so low, rents have grown a lot faster than inflation, than everything else than the prices of everything else, such that now the average asking rent is $155 per month higher than it would have been if rents had just risen with inflation. So there's a lot of stuff going on here, which again we will look more at later this year. But at least just as a general point, the vacancy rates do have an effect on housing costs, and so for that reason we need to take that into account. We can also show a map comparable to what we just showed, which is the transportation analysis zones where the rental vacancy rate specifically has dropped by at least half. And this, again, shows an even more orange map. So again, a region-wide issue that is happening across many different communities and throughout. We've also wanted to put a ballpark number on what it takes to get out of this problem. So to get across the region to a healthier vacancy rate of 5%, we've estimated that we would need an additional 7,600 rental units to get to that healthier rental vacancy rate of 5% across the region. And charting that in comparison with recent housing production, in 2017, as the Community Development Committee heard in June, we produced about 15,200 new units of housing. And so the additional 7,600 rental units would be equivalent to taking half again as much. So increasing our actual production in 2017 by 50%, which is higher than our previous peak of 2004. So again, this does kind of point to a need for more housing production. Not that we want to claim that housing production itself is sufficient to address the affordability problems that our region is experiencing, but it is at least part of the solution to make sure that we are raising our vacancy rates. And the last point that we wanted to leave you with was a bit of national context and the idea that just as no one community in our region is really facing this issue alone, our region is also not facing this alone. This really is a national dynamic that we're experiencing here. So this chart shows, on the basis of Census Bureau estimates, to get an apples-to-apples comparison, the amount of housing unit change across in our metro, 4.4% in the full 16-county metro area, and the 11 peer regions as identified by Greater MSP. So we are actually higher than San Francisco, yay us, but we are actually lagging places like Denver and Seattle and Portland in terms of housing production. The question, though, for the purpose of today, is to what extent this is close to or far from population growth, so the additional demand for new housing. And so what you can see here is that, yes, these other places, Denver, Seattle, Portland, and especially Austin, are also experiencing more population growth. And that with the exception of Pittsburgh and Chicago, all the way on the right side of this chart, none of these have housing production that's sufficient to keep up with their additional population growth since 2010. So the question is, how far apart are these? To what extent is our shortfall of housing better or worse than our peers? And so if we divide these, we can get a sense of that. And what that shows when you take that is that we actually have the third largest shortfall in housing growth among our peer metros. So behind San Francisco and Atlanta, but ahead, well, at least larger than places like Denver and Seattle and Portland that we tend to compare ourselves to. So again, something to keep in mind that even though this is a national problem, when you look at the magnitude of that problem, it seems to be a bit larger here.
Madam Chair.
Yeah,
It'd be really interesting to look at the housing growth in those comparable regions that are doing better than we are and seeing how much of that growth is along transit corridors.
Yeah. There was another comment, I think.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Madam Chair, I just wanted to, I just wonder what those other places are doing in terms of public policy, because the market's operating here. And so that's a driver. But then what are there differences in policy that have been applied in those other places that actually spurred that, the better outcomes with regards to their shortfall? So in other words, it always fascinates me about how much the public agenda can actually move the market and how much the market is actually moving on its own, and driven by price and demand, right? So I don't know what the intersection is there, because sometimes we think as public entities that we can move those things when we have very little effect on them overall. So, for example, I asked staff how much would the city of Minneapolis have to grow in housing in order to meet its need for affordable housing. It was like $500 million. I mean, it was a big number, and the public market is never going to move the sector to 500 million. And so what are the incentives or the things that have to happen in the private market in order to make that happen? That's a role government can play. So that's what I'm asking.
Yeah.
Complicated thing. Did you get what I was trying to get at?
I believe so, Councilmember Cunningham. Thanks. Again, that is not something I have an answer to at my fingertips, but
Okay.
I'll add that to the list of.
I think that's fair.
Yeah, it's just a question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Member Melander.
So just, so within the shortfall, do we have a shortfall within market rate? I mean, and I know the answer that the shortfall is within affordable units, but within these numbers here, do you have the ability to talk about or show market rate versus affordable within the region? Can you talk to shortfall in housing growth?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Melander, off the top of my head.
No, you don't have to, but I'm just saying, be interested, I'd like to have that. I mean, I've seen some data, but I'd just like to see the data that you have and what people, within the region are seeing.
Mm-hmm. Member Latofsky.
Thank you. I just am trying to get a handle on why, and is basically the reason why we are so short in housing is because there weren't that many units being built between 2006 and 2012. So we're just still trying to catch up at the same time that people are moving out of their parents' basements.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Latofsky, we have looked at the what you might call boomerang families, kids in their parents' basements, although that's more complicated than just that. And we did see a slight increase during the recession that has since started to trail off. So that may be a factor in this, but because we're starting at 2010, this would be after the Great Recession. Although to the extent that the Twin Cities Metro kind of experienced the onset of the recession and then experienced the recovery from the recession later than other metros towards the coast did, that could possibly play some role in this, although how much of a role is hard to say.
Maybe we should move to the next slide.
Thank you, and you're almost done.
That is so good, though.
I know, it's obviously a really interesting conversation.
Yeah. Thank you. And to put this in broader context, despite the very real affordability challenges that so many households in our region are facing, we do have comparatively low housing costs. So this chart shows the cost burden rates, the share of households whose housing costs are 30% or more of household income, for these pure metros. And certainly there are very real differences in this overall rate by race and ethnicity, by income level, and so on. But at least kind of at the biggest level, our low cost burden rates and relatively low housing costs are a competitive advantage. And because this touches so much on prosperity and livability and equity, it is something that we want to highlight and think about as so many of these our peers that are farther to the left of this chart with higher cost burden rates as their shortfall in housing production, as they seem to be producing more housing relative to population growth than we are. This is something that we need to be thinking about as a region. So summing up, we are adding people at a steady pace. Smaller households are more common than they used to be, with the caveat that we do still need to pay attention to the segment of the market for larger households. But mainly, we are not adding enough housing to keep up with population growth. We're lagging behind peers, which has implications for the people with the least housing options, so low-income households, people with disabilities, and so on. So given the potential long-term affordability challenges, as most of our new production is not affordable to low-income households, definitely something to keep in mind for the future. And we do plan to come back to you with answers to some of these questions at our affordable housing production presentation later this year. So with that, I will wrap up. More information is on our website. My email address is on the slide there, and I'm happy to take any other questions you might have.
Well, I would just say thank you for this presentation. I think it's been a really interesting discussion and really robust data.
Well
So
done.
thank you. Oh, Member Dorfman, go
I
ahead.
just want to say, I think this was really interesting, but I think the little guy in the back didn't find it so.
We'll have a chat later.
Didn't hear a word.
I appreciate the eyes.
Thank you.
Madam Chair?
Oh, please, Member Chavez.
It's not so much a question as a recommendation. Picking up on Councilmember Dorfman's rhetorical question about transportation and corridors. When we worked on the housing policy plan, the slide that you had in slide 18, which is the bar graph talking about comparative housing cost or burden, when you decide to slice and dice that further, I'd recommend that you consider a comparison to include transportation costs, because the true housing, so-called housing burden includes transportation, and the beginning of an answer as to why, as far as development or not, may be revealed in where that transportation cost is happening, the actual physical, where it's happening.
Thank you, Councilmember Chavez.
Great. Thank you. So
Thank you,
I
Madam
think
Chair and council members.
we will move on now to the next information item, which is the divisional level operating budget, presented by Mary Bogey. Welcome, Mary.
Welcome. Presented by Mary Bogey and the Coastal Division staff.
Excellent.
Good afternoon, council members. Today, I'm here before you to present the preliminary 2019 operating budget and levies. And while we've had discussion in the committees about division level budgets, tonight is really the council's first chance or opportunity to see and hear the proposed budget in full cloth. The preliminary budget is not an end of our budget development cycle. It's just a step along the way. We have two statutory deadlines. They're highlighted in red on the chart here in our budget development timeline. The budget that we are proposing today and that I'll ask you to adopt on August 22nd establishes the upper limit of our property tax levy. After September 1st, the council may lower but not raise its overall property tax levy. Metro area counties will consider our levy amount in establishing their own budgets in tax levies and will mail the truth in taxation notices to property owners showing the proposed amount for property taxes for all jurisdictions. As we move along in our budget development timeline through the public comment draft and to the final budget adoption in December, we may and historically have made changes to our operating budget, but we cannot make changes that would increase our levy amount. Our primary focus today will be on the operating budget. In October, we will be back to highlight the capital program. While changes to our capital program all occur through the amendment process, in that presentation, we'll focus on what's in the capital program, the pressures and policy decisions that occur around that program. Council members, as you began your term here at the council, you established a course that we have been tracking on for our levy. Our levy has some givens. We need to meet our debt service requirements for transit and parks. We have unlimited authority to levy for bonds, for the debt service on bonds that are issued for our transit and parks capital program, although we are effectively limited by our authority to issue bonds for those programs. We also received a portion of the fiscal disparities pool annually for our tax-based revitalization account. We also have some strategy-based decisions. We have chosen to hold the total levy to a 2% increase annually and to maximize the livable communities and general purpose levies to create a TOD program within the livable communities demonstration account and to provide funding for small targeted initiatives within the general purpose levy. There are some pressures on our ability to sustain a 2% overall levy strategy into the future. Our non-debt service levy limits each year increase in accord with a measure of governmental inflation called the implicit price deflator. Over the past 10 years, the average increase has been 2%, but we've experienced years of 1% growth or a less than 1% growth. And for 2019, it's a 2.8% increase. The primary use of our regional transit bonding is for fleet replacement. And we have been successful with the legislature in gaining an increase in our annual bonding authority that reflects a 4.5% increase on those bus replacements. And while that's a big deal and really great for our capital program, it places pressure on the levy needed to repay that debt and our desire to stay within that 2% overall increase. These pressures would indicate a 3% annual growth rate for our levy, but we've been able to manage within that 2% growth because the TIBRA, highway right-of-way, and parks debt service levies have not been providing pressures on the levy. As I said, the tax-based revitalization account is an amount statutorily defined as a portion of fiscal disparities. And we are again recommending that we forego a levy for the highway right-of-way program, as that loan fund has sufficient reserves, about $14 million, to meet its needs into the future. The parks debt service levy has also been declining recently, and we'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. The council has been a very good steward of its levy. And as this chart shows, the council's property tax levy, shown in the orange, has grown at a much slower rate than other governments in the region. Now, I know that we're not apples to apples. Other government jurisdictions have different pressures than we have in different levies, but the council increase since 2003 of 23% is significantly lower than that of other jurisdictions. I want to spend a little bit of time with each of our levies. Our transit debt levy, as I said, is pressuring our overall levy. And I think that this slide really helps to envision what that pressure might look like both today and in the future. So the legislature grants us annual authority for our transit bonding. And today we have about $181 million outstanding debt for transit. The bar chart shows that within that 2% levy limit that we're trying to hold our overall levy to, the transit debt service would grow from 55% today to over 70% in 2028. And that would effectively squeeze our ability to levy for our other purposes. And again, that assumes a 2% rate and that we stay with our outstanding debt of that kind of that $180 million range. And so that's not necessarily the whole story. We could certainly look at increasing our outstanding debt, lengthening our repayment terms. But this slide kind of is a really nice slide to show you kind of, in a all things being equal world, that pressure that transit debt service levy would put on our other levies and our ability to stay within a 2% reasonable increase to the levy. The park debt service levy is a wholly different story. Our capital program has historically assumed a matching of our regional bonds with state geo bonds for parks that reflected about a $7 million issuance of bonds each year. As the state funding has changed over the years, we have received less and less state geo bond funding. This chart shows the change in the funding mix over time to specific project earmarks, shown in purple, and legacy and environmental trust fund, shown in green and yellow, depending on our statutory matching requirements. So our historic practice no longer matches our funding sources, and that leads to a policy discussion that is set to occur in the Community Development Committee. We may pursue a mix of legislative and policy changes that will help us to more effectively leverage both our levy as well as our authority. So we currently have 4.6 million outstanding and have no issuances in 2017 or 2018. And as this chart shows, since 2003, the outstanding debt has dropped by over 26 million, and we are paying debt off faster than we are issuing new debt. Our recommended levy for 2019 does not include an anticipatory levy for parks debt service, but only the amount necessary to pay for current maturities on existing debt. Our livable communities levies fund our grant programs administered by community development. Again, the tax-based revitalization account receives $5 million annually from the regional fiscal disparities pool and is used to clean up polluted land in the metropolitan area. Our livable communities demonstration account levy is proposed at the levy limit of $12 million for 2019. That's a 2.8% increase, or about $300,000. Again, our strategy has been to grow that levy to accommodate a $5 million transit-oriented development component within that grant program. Since 2003, the levy has been increased by $3.8 million, and we are on track by 2023 to meet that $5 million goal. The local housing incentives account receives statutory transfers both from the livable communities demonstration account and from our general purposes levy, and that is used to help communities meet their affordable and life cycle housing goals. And finally, we have our general purpose levy proposed at $15.3 million. That's the levy limit for 2019. The general purpose levy is, of course, my favorite levy because it is the most flexible money we have here at the council. It can be used to carry out the council responsibilities that are provided in law. We do have some primary funding responsibilities from the general purpose levy, including the operations of our community development division at $9.7 million for 2019 and $1 million transfer to the local housing incentives account. Historically, we've also funded a portion of the regional administration budget from our general purpose levy, but since 2014, we have fully allocated the regional administrative costs out to the divisions that we support, and that leaves $4.6 million available for targeted initiatives that are either one-time in nature, pilots, or projects that are in need of a bridge to another funding source. For 2019, we are recommending the following initiatives to be funded from the general purpose levy. Our housing program is experiencing a structural issue, and you'll hear more about that as community development comes forward to present. $2.2 million is proposed to subsidize this program and preserve our existing service levels for 2019 for housing vouchers while a longer-term strategy proceeds through the Community Development Committee. $500,000 is recommended for stormwater management grants. $1.3 million is proposed for initial commitment to an ADA compliance. This is a council-wide effort and has already begun with work on an ADA compliance report and plan. These funds are seen as initial funds to get started across the council. Also recommended are funds for a customer relationship management system and repairs to our Robert Street building plaza to address leakage and access concerns. Finally, here's a chart that you've become familiar with through our budget presentations that shows year-over-year change in our total levies. The total proposed levy is a 2% increase to $87 million. I do want to draw your attention back to our debt service levies towards the bottom of this table and point out the significant shift between the parks debt service levy and the transit debt service levy. The $1.3 million proposed for parks represents the amount needed to service existing debt, and there is no anticipatory levy for 2019. Using that available gap under the 2% levy strategy, we increased the transit debt service levy, and that will help ease the pressure on this levy in future years. This shift impacts homeowners outside and inside the transit taxing district quite differently, and as we will see on this next slide. Here we have that typical $250,000 homeowner, and with all of my caveats about all things being equal, year over year it maintains its value. If that homeowner resides inside the transit taxing district, they're going to see a 3% or $1.58 increase in their levy from the council, and if they're outside the transit taxing district, a 15.5% decrease or $2.90 decrease in their levy from the council. And again, as we know, all things aren't equal, and year over year, individual taxpayers will have different experiences depending on factors like their increasing home values and that of their neighborhoods. Also need to point out that depending on decisions that we make around parks levy and the parks capital program, we will see a shift back between inside and outside of the transit taxing district as we continue that levy again. Putting our levy into context with other metro transit taxing jurisdictions, and as we saw on the chart that I had forward earlier, the council has a declining share of the revenue from the metro area tax dollar, and we represent about 1.6% of all of the tax revenues collected in the metro area. There are no questions on the levies. I'd like to move forward and talk through the operating budget. So far, so good?
Go ahead.
All right. So I'm going to start with an overall look at the operating budget, and then we will drill down into the individual divisions' budgets. For 2019, the proposed operating budget is $1.1 billion and represents a 4.6% increase over the 2018 budget and breaks out between operations, pass-through, debt service, and other post-employment benefits. Our other post-employment benefits, while they're really small on the chart here, reflect our fully funded status for retiree health care liability and the use of our OPEB reserve to pay medical premiums for retirees rather than our operating funds paying those premiums. As with last year, the earnings on our OPEB fund are projected to exceed our 2019 budget needs and will result in a $4.9 million addition to reserves. This growth is anticipated in our funding of our future liabilities for OPEB. The increase that we see in the pass-through this year is primarily reflected of our drawdown and disbursement of I&I state grants that are end grants and therefore dispersed at the end of those projects. And those communities should be completing those projects in 2019, and we would expect to draw down and disperse about $8.7 million in state funds. We've already talked about debt service pressures as they relate to the property tax levy. Lisa Thompson will speak in more detail about debt service pressures on wastewater rates and the environmental services budget. On the right side of this chart, we burst out the year-over-year change in our operations category of the budget, which represents about a 3.6% increase over the prior year adopted budget. Salaries and benefits represent about 60% of our operations budget. The year-over-year that we see in this chart is a little bit skewed because we had in the prior year, we adopted a pretty significant amendment in Metro Transit that lowered their base. And so if I take into consideration that amendment, the change in that salary line would look more like a 3% increase that I would expect. And that results primarily from wage and benefit increases in our labor contracts. Most of the increase in the contracted services is related to our transit provider contracts and technology-related pressures from hardware-software maintenance. This next chart shows our sources and uses in our operating budget. The left side pie chart is a breakout by division, and please note that the regional administration is broken out and contained within the divisional budgets there. Of note on the right side pie chart, charges for services, both wastewater and fares, represent about a third of our sources for our operating budget, and state revenues, state appropriations, as well as motor vehicle sales tax also represent about a third. The federal government contributes $107 million to our operating budget, primarily through the HRA, passing through to landlords in our housing assistance program, and also in our transportation budget for preventative maintenance. Property taxes represent about 8% of our operating budget, primarily, again, for debt service and grant programs. As we look at our operations, only about 2% of our operations are funded with our property tax levy. Other is primarily investment income, and most of that is related to our OPEB plan assets. We do have a planned use of reserves in our operations of about $23.8 million. That's primarily in transportation, and that's offset by addition to reserves, both in debt service, $8.7 million, and in OPEB, $4.9 million. This next chart shows the proposed FTEs, 4,575. This is an increase over last year, 4,463, and those changes are primarily transportation-related activities, about 98 positions there. I'm going to move on and drill down into our general fund. Our general fund operations are proposed at $80 million. As you are aware, the general fund is used to account for regional administration and the administrative activities of community development. The sources of funding are a general purpose levy and the regional administration cost allocation to operating divisions. The transfers out shown in the middle of pie chart represent the targeted initiatives and the statutory transfers funded by the general purpose levy. The proposed regional administration budget for 2019 is $71 million, including the targeted general purpose initiatives. The increase is 6.2%, and this is due primarily to increases in two departments: information services and human resources. All other departments are in line with normal inflationary increases. The charts at the bottom of the slide highlight the contributing factors to the regional administration budget increase. Primarily, these are related to hardware and software maintenance for our technical infrastructure. They continue to experience inflationary pressures that are beyond normal inflation. 4.2 FTEs have been positioned to address workforce development efforts. And we did have an accounting change where we centralized lease lines that do not impact the overall council budget, but significantly increase the regional administration budget. This is finally the last slide for me in this presentation, and that shows our regional administration allocation to other divisions. This is reflective of the services that we provide to those divisions, and depending on the service area, the basis for allocation might be FTEs, it could be transaction counts, or it could be system access. Questions for me before we move on to community development? With that, we'll welcome.
Oh, sorry, that was I thought it was I'm good. I have a
So,
question.
just so I'm riding down the street with my 1972 Schwinn Continental, which I do have, and this is a true story, and some crabby person comes to me and says, "Hey, what are you doing there? And he starts kind of pointing at me, and it was a he, not a she. And he asked me a question. He says, "You got there 8 years ago and you were here, and now you're here." And this individual was pretty well read. I mean, he said you had this many people, now you're this. I mean, is there a way without creating a bunch of work for you to just kind of show the increases and where they were? So when I see this guy again, and I think it'd be helpful that I, kind of have this historical review of, because I remember when we started here, we were like about $700 million with about 3,300 people. I think, is that kind of where we were? And now we're at 42 and we're 1.1, and it'd just be helpful. I don't want you to go to a lot of work, but it certainly would be, if you could do kind of the Cliff Note version too.
Chair and
some
council members,
comparisons.
there's absolutely something that we can do about that, and we try to address that as we present. But if we think about over the years since 2003, the things that have changed at the council, we've implemented light rail lines, a couple of them. So, there's a.
Well, I'm not even
number of
talking about
things that-
2003. I'm just talking since we got here,
Right.
or most of us.
So absolutely, we can do that. And actually, we are planning in our presentation in December, as we're kind of waiting for that public hearing time to open up, to do some reflection of what this council has done in its years at the council, what accomplishments that we've made, all the way from implementing a compensation structure, self-insuring our medical, implementing light rail lines. So there's a number of accomplishments across this council, both financial and in terms of how we've grown, that I think will be of good interest to you.
Thanks.
Great. Member Elkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In conjunction that, I think it would be useful to kind of compare and contrast the increases in the budget with the increases in the volumes of service that we're providing, so that we can, come up with some kind of a unit cost. Because I suspect that if we, looked at, cost per rider or cost per gallon of sewage treatment, that it's probably less than inflation on a unit cost basis.
Good.
Great. Other questions or comments? Okay.
All right, with that, I'd welcome community development.
Good afternoon, council members. Heather and I are going to talk through the community development budget this afternoon for you, and I'll start off and then turn it over to Heather for some more details in the numbers. So I'm Lisa Barajas, Community Development Director, and I just wanted to talk about some accomplishments that we had over the last couple of years that have been funded by special initiatives and work that has been in addition to our everyday work at the council. And one success I like to highlight that many of you have heard about is the council's investment in our Planet program and our local planning handbook. We were recently recognized by the American Planning Association as a national best practice for the work that we've done in this area. Specifically planning assistance for thriving communities, which was a multi-format package of online resources that our staff created to assist local governments in the update of their local comprehensive plans. So that included everything from the training series that we put on in 2016 and 2017, and the full-scale update of the handbook and all the tutorials and fact sheets and additional information that went into that, and other accessible online tools. The council had budgeted additional funds for this project in 2016 and 17 as well, and for Planet. And while the handbook was produced with in-house staff resources over that time period, which I must say other regions were really impressed by and asked, "How much did you spend on that?" And they said, "We did it in-house." And they're entirely impressed. They wanted to know who our contractor was. So shout out to our IS staff for making it look so wonderful. Other opportunities we've had too, as you know, a large part of our budget is the parks and livable community units pass through a significant amount of funds through to implementing agencies and to cities across the region. Our grant programs leverage state, regional, and local funds to help cities expand affordable housing opportunities, build more livable communities, and to build regional parks that expand and maintain the regional system. Our current grant portfolio is over $225 million and will increase as additional grant agreements are executed. I like to highlight some new livable communities videos that Community Development Committee is also familiar with. So if you haven't touched into it or aren't familiar with, on our website is available today are videos that demonstrate the value that our Livable Communities program brings to the region. They actually show it. We talk about it a lot, but actually show that value. We have both videos that talk about the program as a whole, as well as specific projects that demonstrate what the intent of the program is and how it's been effective in the local cities across the region. Our communication staff and our LCA staff have been working hard on that, and I encourage you all to take a look at that on our website. And finally, our HRA program offers rental assistance to low-income households across the region. And as Mary had mentioned earlier, we're facing a structural imbalance, both due to rising housing costs that Matt had talked about earlier. It's increasing pressure on our housing voucher program, and the federal reimbursement rates that don't cover our expenses. It's a highly volatile piece that Heather will talk a little bit more about in a minute. We are seen as a leader both in the region and in the country for our housing operations. Our staff have implemented process improvements and technology projects that have made us more efficient, and we plan to continue that work in 2019 and beyond. So you may recall in the past where we moved to our new application system called Happy that's allowed us to be paperless. That was because of a council investment that allowed us to make that investment to streamline our administrative processes. I want to turn it over to Heather to talk more about our proposed budget going forward.
Hey, so Heather Augustin-Hebner, Finance Director for CD and MTS. The chart that you're looking at here is a real-life consequence to our budget of the housing trends that you heard about earlier from Matt and that Mary touched on in her presentation. So this chart shows what's been happening to the cost of our average housing payments over time. These are tied to rental market conditions. The historic growth rate of about 2% a year has seen a rapid increase in the past couple years. Between 2011 and 2016, subsidy payments were relatively flat, and any fluctuations we were able to manage those by use of our reserves. In 2017 and 2018, the increases in subsidy payments have depleted our reserves. The structural issue for housing vouchers is caused by the federal subsidy is basically it's a year behind. So our federal funds are typically allocated by what we spend in the previous year. So if we spend $50 million in one year, we're going to get paid $50 million in the next year. If we expend $52 million, we'll see $52 million in the next year. So every year there's a 1-year lag between what our expenditures are and what our federal revenue is. So the current average housing assistance payment is about $740 a month, and we receive $710 in federal funding. That leaves a $30 shortfall for each voucher. So if you play this out over the course of the year, that's $30 a month times 12 months times 6,500 families, that's about $2.34 million. Although the proposed 2019 budget uses general purposes levy to maintain the program through next year, this is a bridge. It's not a structural solution. The structural solution that we have right now is to reduce the number of housing vouchers that we issue to low-income families in the region. If we reduced vouchers in 2018 to balance the budget, we would have had to reduce the number of families in the project by about 200, and that we would end the year leasing about 93% of our available housing vouchers. Our HRA administration side of the budget also has a structural issue. The percentage of expenditure HUD will reimburse has been trending downward and varies year by year. So there's been a gap, and there's been a gap for a very long time. And historically, we've been able to fill the gap with other resources. We receive rent payments on housing, on council-owned housing, and until 2014, the general purposes levy subsidized our regional allocation costs. So during this period, reserves had been gradually growing, and in the last couple of years, we've been depleting those reserves at the same time when the available rent receipts that we're getting from our council-owned housing are getting lower, because the housing is getting older, so we're having to reinvest more of that rental income into maintenance of those housing units. So both this and the subsidy issue I talked about on the previous slide are currently under review by the Community Development Committee. We've presented to them a couple times. We have a number of questions and issues we're digging into further, and we'll be bringing that back to the committee. Again, the proposed budget in 2019 does subsidize HRA with general levy funds to maintain the program into 2019. So our current operations budget maintains our current.
Member Barber, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I've brought this discussion up both in Community Development and Management Committee, so I'm sure you've heard it more than once, but I just want to point out that I'm really concerned a little bit about the subsidizing the HRA program with general purpose levy money, because that encompasses the entire region versus where only a portion of the region utilizes us to administer HRA services. And I think we did have some discussions in Management Committee specifically about longer term potential solutions. And however we look at this, I want to ensure that when we do look at this, that we don't look at this as the long-term fix. I know you talked about it as a bridge. However, we had the presentation earlier about how volatile the housing market is and prices are going up, and that's really what's driving this issue. And so I want to make sure that as we look at this issue, we're very cognizant that we are coming up with sort of a Band-Aid solution that the entire region would have to help pay for. That's only helping small parts of the region.
Member Cunningham.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And on that note, I actually agree with Councilmember Barber on this question of how we spread the levy with regards to this issue. I think this is a bigger issue in our conversations, both at community development and at management, have been all of the HRAs are facing a similar situation. And the question of possibly thinking about bringing them together to talk about a joint solution around this issue instead of us thinking we have to solve it by ourselves. And I think that the fact that we are moving into a situation where we're up against the wall in terms of what the solutions are might free up the ability for everyone to think fresh about how we solve this problem, because we're dealing with a legacy of how these institutions were structured some years ago. And we could actually think about how we restructure these relationships so they actually work for us today. And I think the council should play a role, some kind of role in actually beginning that conversation. So I just put that on the table for something to think about, because I think if we continue to think we're going to solve the problem by ourselves, we just won't have the resources to do it, given what we see coming down from the federal government in terms of supports. And it might be a good opportunity for others that are having the same problem put their stuff on the table and say, okay, how would we manage this differently? So just put that on the table, Madam Chair, for your consideration.
Member Chavez.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just to join in that part of the conversation, my request is when we return to this conversation at either community development and or management, I think it would be helpful for at least priming the pump, stimulating the conversation, the discussion as to what other options theoretically exist, you know, the typical analysis, benefits, deficits as to what it means. And then also, again, way outside the box, you know, what innovative creature can be established by your team that will solve the problem for the entire country?
No pressure. Madam Chair, council members, our staff have taken your comments seriously from Community Development and Management Committee and have begun exploring those issues and kind of laying out on the table what are all the different options that are available to us. And so we will be bringing back some of those for your consideration, pros and cons, and some other opportunities that we have forthcoming as well to consider. We have considered some other partnerships that we currently have enabling statute to undertake as a first start, and then have been exploring that and what that might look like. But we'll be bringing that conversation back to you. I don't know if we'll solve the national housing crisis right away, though.
Thank you.
Any other comments on this? Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
So as I mentioned before, our 2019 proposed budget is a maintain operations budget. So looking at our operations as a whole, total revenues and expenses come in at about $18 million. Nearly half of our operations budget funds the HRA. The remaining half is for district management, regional allocations, and a number of units, including parks, livable communities, research, and local planning assistance. We use about 80% of our budget to pay for staff and regional allocation support needed to operate our programs. The remaining 20% of the budget is used for contracted services and other costs. Property tax and federal dollars pay for 84% of our operations. Other smaller sources of revenue include council-owned housing, which you'll see represented on this chart by the acronym FAHP, F-A-H-P, and small amounts of transfers. This chart takes a look at our pass-through budget. Over 80% of the community development budget is comprised of pass-through dollars for housing assistance, regional parks implementing agencies, and livable community cities. The pass-through program is funded by state, federal, and local dollars. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Any other questions for CD? Seeing none, thank you. I think next up then is transportation, it looks like. Welcome, Nick and Ed.
Good afternoon, Chair, committee members. Ed Petrie, Metro Transit.
Nick Thompson, MTS.
And we will go through the transportation budget. I'll go through the first few slides and through the Metro Transit portion, then turn it over to Nick. First slide is on Thrive in Motion, which is the C line, which many of you are very familiar with. We're going to begin construction of this line or work on construction of this line in 2018 with a planned opening in 2019. The total fleet non-project cost of this, or the total non-fleet project cost of this line will be about $20 million. And it'll be an 8.5-mile line from downtown Minneapolis to Brooklyn Park and Brooklyn Center area. It has 23 stations. Some of the benefits include faster trips and benefits, including pre-boarding, fare payment, just like the light rail lines, old door boarding, just like the light rail lines, or they'll pay offline. The doors will open. They'll board the bus just like they do on the train. We have transit signal priority and curb extensions. Our ridership today is around 7,600 daily rides with a planned growth to about 9,300 by year 2030. Another item that we are working on that my staff and Nick's staff are working very closely on is our Thrive in Motion with the Transit Asset Management Plan. With the federal government, with the FTA, our first draft of our Transit Asset Management Plan is due to the FTA in October of 2018. We're currently going through a final review of the first draft of the Transit Asset Management Plan. We plan to bring it to the council in September for your review and concurrence on the plan. But the first plan will then be due to the FTA in October.
In MTS, to highlight tonight is the travel behavior inventory. We began data collection in October of this year. 2017 marked the transition from doing this survey every 10 years to a sequence that we will do it every 2 years to give much better data that go into our planning and forecasting processes. This will this is a partnership we had with the region through the TAB and through MnDOT funding this more occurring. It represents a key partnership as our local partners see this data as one of the keys for their planning efforts also. We completed the initial pilot this spring, and the survey kicks off October 1st, and we expect to have data and results of this in late 2019. Second effort, the Metro Mobility Task Force, which was completed in February, as ways to improve this service, to limit some of the cost growth and improve the efficiency and service for the customers. We had several recommendations from the task force report that we are working on incorporating. One of these we had hoped to pass this past legislative session where we'd be able to share data with DHS, and we think that that is one of the key opportunities to kind of bring some federal funds into this to reduce some of the regional costs in the service. We also continue to work with the TNCs, the transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft, trying to find a way that they would fit into this service to allow us another way to reduce some of our costs and manage some of our growth.
The next slide is a slide under transit ridership, the forecast for 2019. We're forecasting 95.7 million rides. One of the things that you will notice is a slight increase in the ridership between 18 and 19. This is the main reason is due to the recovery due to the fare increase. If you recall, when we did the fare increase back in October 2017, we had forecasted about a 4 to 5% decline in ridership with a 24-month recovery period. So this does anticipate the recovery period continuing into the year 2019. The other piece that Nick will talk about when he gets into the Metro Mobility budget is Metro Mobility is seeing a little higher ridership growth than what the rest of the system is seeing. Metro Mobility is forecasting about a 6.4% growth in 2019, which Nick will talk about when they get into the Metro Mobility numbers. Overall, the transit operations, it's a $593 million budget. We have the uses by department, category, and the sources on this slide. You will note the Metro Transit portion is $472 million, or 80%. This would include Metro Transit bus operations, the blue and the green line, and then the commuter rail operations North Star. The Metropolitan Transportation Services family is $121 million, or 20% of the budget, which would include Metro Mobility, Transit Link and Vanpool, planning, and contracted services. Uses by category, as you're very well aware, we are a very labor-intensive organization with transit. $344 million, or 58% of the budget is labor and benefits. We have contracted services in at about $29 million, or 5%, which would include various consulting contracts and the Burlington Northern contract with BNSF to run North Star. Materials and supplies is $55 million, or 9%. Mainly includes all the bus parts, rail parts, and the diesel fuel. Transit programs are $92 million, or 15% of the budget, which would include Metro Mobility, the Transit Link and Vanpool, and contracted fixed route services. We have our cost allocations coming from regional administration, then other costs, which would include some advertising costs, lease costs, insurance costs, and utilities, those types of costs. When you get to the sources, our various sources, the largest portion is state revenues, which is motor vehicle sales tax and state appropriations. Our charges for services would be our passenger fares on the transit system, $115 million, or 19%. We have the federal funds, which Mary had talked about, coming into the operations. Local money, this is mainly local money that would be paying for the match or the subsidy on the light rail system and the commuter rail system coming from the counties and MnDOT. Other revenues, which would include about $8 million, would mainly include interest income and advertising income. You see many of our buses and trains wrapped. That would be that source of revenue. And then we have a planned use of reserves of $22 million for our revenue allocation policy. So with that, then we'll break it down into the Metro Transit family and the MTS family. First, moving into the Metro Transit family, it's about a $472 million budget. You can see on the left-hand side the uses. That includes our bus system of $345 million. And then we have the Metro Blue Line, Green Line, North Star, And capital salaries, those are salaries of staff that are working on the capital projects like the Blue Line Extension, Green Line Extension, any of our buildings or anything that we're building. Those are salaries that are being paid for with capital funds. On the uses, you can see we are very labor intensive, 71%, or $337 million is salaries and benefits. And then, as I've described before, we have our contracted services, materials and supplies, which would be the fuel and the parts, regional allocations and other costs, which again would include the advertising, leases, insurance, and utilities. On the sources of revenues, it would include the largest portion would be state revenues of $277 million, which again is motor vehicle sales tax and state appropriations. The charges for services are passenger fares in at $104 million, or a plan of 22% recovery. The federal funds coming in, as Mary has discussed. Local funding of $37 million, which would be for the rail lines, both commuter and light rail coming from the counties. Other revenues of $8 million, which is mainly advertising revenue and interest, and then the planned use reserves of $13 million.
The MTS budget is very similar to what we reviewed last year. Our budget maintains operations or ridership levels for all of our contracted services, with the exception of Metro Mobility, where we continue to experience growth after a year last year where we were fairly flat in our growth. Looking at MTS as a whole, total revenues and expenses come in at just over $121 million. Over 90% of our budget is used to fund transit service, with the remaining about 8% funds for our planning and our MPO role at the council. In contrast to Metro Transit's budget, where you saw salaries as a primary use, 77% of our budget is used to pay contractors that provide Metro Mobility, contracted fixed route, Transit Link, and Dial-A-Ride. Our expenses are rounded out with salaries and benefits, RA allocations, and contracted services. The state provides 77% of our revenues in the form of general fund and MVEST. State general fund is the primary source for Metro Mobility, and MVEST funds other operations, including federal match on our planning function. So we'll close here with a slide kind of relating this budget to our state fiscal year and looking forward. We began 2018 and we began 2019 with a structural deficit, which was presented here before. But in the last session, we did receive non-state one-time funds of $70 million, and we were using available reserves in 2018 and 2019 to have a balanced budget. Looking forward, we continue that structural deficit for the next two bienniums. Knowing this, we've been planning our operations and withholding costs wherever we can to build up our reserves. And you see in 2020, we're using $51 million of available reserves to again balance the forecasted budget, state fiscal year. But it's state fiscal year 2021, beginning in July of 2020, where we begin that we no longer have sufficient reserves to balance out that structural deficit. And this is the forecast that we see through 2021 through 2023. The bottom line is that deficit, transportation deficit facing this council. With that, we'll stand for questions.
Member Dorfman.
Ed, question, do we think the operator shortage and our response to that is, do we anticipate that's going to have an impact on overall ridership numbers?
Chair, committee members, that's one of the things that, first of all, that we're watching very closely is the fact is that, once you start adjusting service, you would hope that the customers would look on both sides and say, okay, right. I had a 7:10 route, there's a 7 o'clock or 7:20. Could I take one of those and still make that work with my daily commute for work and or school? So we're watching that very closely. One of the things I will report, though, is that since the news has gone out about our operator shortage and having to trim some of our, temporarily trim some of our routes, the number of applicants coming in is starting to increase. Right. So the word is getting out, so we're very hopeful. We're very hopeful that as long as the applicants are increasing, that they can actually turn in and become full-time operators. So that, it's a positive and negative, but we're hopeful by that.
Thanks. Other questions or comments? I think this is really helpful, to see really clearly what the financial position is especially from 2021 and beyond. It's a significant challenge to see that we're going to be facing a major deficit in the future. So it'll be good to start talking about that more actively.
Okay.
I think no other questions, so we can move on to the next.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Environmental Services, welcome.
Madam Chair and council members, Lisa Thompson, General Manager of Environmental Services, and with me is
Ned Smith, Director of Finance and Revenue for Environmental Services.
So we're going to give you a quick break from numbers and give you a few highlights of things that we've been doing in the almost decade since you've been here. So kind of to Harry's point, what's happened since you were here? And money can be kind of a dry topic, but when it allows you to do exciting things, we have to remind ourselves of that. And I think because time passes quickly and we get kind of caught up in the day-to-day, sometimes we sort of, lose sight of all the great things that we've done. So I'm hoping to take a quick run through because I know time is of essence here tonight, so you can see some of the Thrive Connected accomplishments that we've had. So let's go back to 2014 when I became the general manager for environmental services, and we were hearing the calls for wastewater to think of itself more as a resource, that there's elements within the wastewater we should be harvesting, but most in particular, we should recycle that wastewater. And in order to do that, we're going to have to increase collaborations because we wouldn't be able to do that on our own. So 2 years later, the Utility of the Future Awards were presented, and we were one of the first organizations to get that for our quick actions on that. Here's some of those ways in which we were noted as a model for the nation. Engaging communities to build a collaborative water supply. This one has an interesting history because in 2014, in the fall of that year, the council members received letters of complaints about ES not being very collaborative with the water supply planning work. So we met with those representatives from American Public Works Association and City Engineers Association in Minnesota and representatives from metro cities. And we found out that we had some common ground to work together on more than we had in the past. So we've made, I think, really significant strides from that in terms of increasing the participation around water supply and other One Water things. But we had a MOSAC, Metro Area Water Supply Advisory Committee, which was policy-based, and now we also have a technical advisory committee. And so we have now 31 leaders from across the region that are providing participation and guidance on our water supply. This one you've recently had discussions in the Committee of the Whole on. It's a milestone for us to be in this region already looking at wastewater reuse. It's very important to the future because we can take reclaimed water and meet growing regional water needs. And we actually have a possible project that we would do with our Empire facility. And we have a facility that we no longer operate. It was the Rosemont facility. It's in the right position for us to be able to build an additional treatment process there. So we're moving forward with a design of that. In terms of green infrastructure, our Empire plant, which was expanded a few years ago, used to discharge to the Vermilion River, which is a trout stream. And in order to protect that trout stream, we didn't want to raise temperature with too much effluent being entered. So we put a very long effluent pipe to the Mississippi River. But we also did some other things to protect the runoff from the stormwater into that Vermilion River. And we piloted several innovative green infrastructure practices. And we're now reaping the benefits and sharing those results so that others can look at those and make good decisions for their own stormwater management strategies. So this project in particular was actually featured at WEFTEC 2017 as an especially innovative project. And WEFTEC is kind of our go-to premier technical organization for the wastewater industry and water industry. We also had water reuse awards. So if you've been to the Saints Stadium, you'll know that they have signage there that says that the stormwater captured from the transit facility next door is used for flushing their toilets and irrigating their ball fields and grounds. So in 2015, the Freshwater Society awarded the Clean Water Champion Award to the council as well as the city in the Capital Region Watershed District. And then in 2017, we received a second award called the Clean Water Champion Award for helping communities in the metro area reduce or offset their groundwater demands by looking at other ways to provide water supply. And another water supply focused one was an award that we received from the University of Minnesota for the work that we've been doing with communities to help, or industries, I should say, to conserve water use, and it actually reduces their costs. So we have been able to accomplish a lot of conservation in water with that. And then one more award before I wrap this up, the 2017 Environmental Initiative Awards for the Governmental Solar Garden Subscriber Collaborative. In 2016, when that came online, we had 33 watts of energy being produced, which is the equivalent of 5,700 homes. And we've had many communities tell us that they would not have been able to do solar in their community if they hadn't had the assistance that we provided through that collaboration. Inflow and infiltration, a topic you've heard about frequently because we've been working at this for quite a while. Here's some results that we can share. If the top section shows the increasing in rainfall, so rainfall's going up, which if we know we have leaky pipes, it's going to cause more flow. The green dashed lines in the middle show that we're actually having our flow that we're treating decrease. So that could mean that we're getting less rain flow into our pipes, so we're treating less of that. And then if you look at the bottom bars, it's showing an increasing population, so we should be getting more flow because there's more population being served. Though we know that conservation is a factor in there, so folks are using more conservation-focused appliances, so you have to factor that piece in. But we're seeing the benefits of our I&I program. And on off to the right there, we just provided to the public a website focused on I&I. So homeowners, the private side is a big part of this issue, and there haven't been many resources for them. So we've created this website. The communities can use it. It'll be there for the residents of this region, and we hope it'll become a trusted source of information for them on I&I issues. Capital improvement in the region. In the last 8 years, the council has invested just under $1 billion on capital improvements in our wastewater system. So we're actively protecting the public health and environment, ensuring that the infrastructure will continue to operate efficiently and can accommodate growth. We started another collaboration. There's lots of water entities doing monitoring in the region. And in order to make good water decisions, we need good information and data. So this group came together and they're sharing best practices with each other and sharing data with each other so that that information that's needed to make good decisions will happen. And we're facilitating that. We recently were the host for the One Water Summit. It's the third One Water Summit that's been held, and we broke the record on attendance. And we've had all kinds of folks tell us it was the best yet. I went to the National Association of Clean Water Agencies conferences 2 weeks ago, and I had several people from across the country walk up to me and say, Minnesota did the best ever. The turnout from Minnesotans and the stories that were shared were really impactful. So that's kudos to everybody that's helped make that possible. And a highlight that isn't a change, and we hope to keep as it is that intention of meeting our mission, our core mission to protect the public health and environment. And our regulatory compliance is one way in which we look at that. And I just want to point out on this, at the top of the peak there is Hastings and St. Croix with 27 and 26 years. There's only 3 facilities across the country that can beat that record. We had, if you've been to any of our budget open houses, they can be kind of boring, a lot of numbers, not real interactive. And if you came to the one that we had this year, you wouldn't recognize it. So we've been gradually making changes through recent years. And our objective was to pack more value into the experience. So we went to an open house setting. And in the past, we used to be careful that we didn't have more staff than attendees because it was hard to get people to attend. And we flipped it around. We had 10 stations with staff from those areas that were present. And so people they heard a short presentation, but they could drill in with their specific questions and concerns. and find out from the subject matter experts what kinds of information they needed to have. So it was well attended, and we had really positive feedback. This one I'm going to probably almost totally skip over because you heard about the closure of it tonight. But we're still all doing high fives about the fact that people were so shocked at the outcome of simplifying our bureaucratic process a bit, though it's a challenge with the SAC system, and surprising them that we really listened to them and tried to do that. So with that, I've tried to make these budget presentations, the last one that I'll be doing for you folks, not so dry, because I know numbers can be really hard, especially when you're looking at spreadsheets. Well, so this year I figured out the perfect solution. I handed that part off to Ned.
Thank you, Lisa. These numbers you saw 2 weeks ago as part of the approval of the rates. So just very excited to announce, though, that we are still keeping our rates below a 4% increase as we committed to our customers. I'll talk through that in a little bit. And again, never pass up a chance to say that our sewer access charge has been flat since January 1 of 2014. Industrial waste charges and industrial waste permit fees also in line with our customer promises. This highlights again what a great wastewater bargain we offer here in the Twin Cities for wastewater treatment. These are the latest numbers in from NACWA. We've got our 2018 is a preliminary estimate. We're in the middle of our actual formal surveys right now, but you can see we are still down in the 40% cheaper than our peers across the country, with us at $299 per year for annual wastewater treatment versus a $517 average across the country. So that just reinforces our commitment that we've made to our customers. In 2018, we were below 4% at 3.7. 2019, we're at 3.5. If we did nothing and just let the debt service bubble ride, we'd be at a 4 to 5% increase. So we made a commitment to our customers. We're going to take some extra steps to make sure that we can keep 2020 through 2022 below 4%. That includes aggressive asset management, implementing asset management principles where we try to prioritize what needs maintenance versus what needs replacement. How can we strategically plan that out, as well as centralizing our project budgets in order to make sure that we are reserving money until we absolutely know it's needed. And I'll walk through that a little bit more on the pie charts. And then long-term goal, we want to stay in line with inflation. And this is one of our customer service promises to make sure our rates are fair and predictable across the region. So the individual uses, you can see uses by department. Operations, that is our interceptors and our plants, and all of the folks that maintain and the plant behind those. Technical services is our lab and our systems and processes. And then our administration is centralized things, pass-through grants, as well as finance, because you can't run an office without finance. And then we have maintenance services at 7%. In terms of uses by category, you can see salary and benefits are our number one use. And then the rest is kind of spread out across the rest of the functions. The key thing to point out here is these charts look very similar to what they would last year. I do want to, and years prior. I do want to point out, though, uses by department. The administration and portion would look larger than last year by about $6 million, and that is one of the tools that we're using to maintain our 4% or less is centralizing project budgets. So what we heard from our department managers was looking out 18 months, they couldn't really tell us exactly what projects they needed. So if you were building a budget, you were putting those budget dollars embedded in the departments. 18 months later, things might change, priorities might change, but it's harder to change the budget. So what we're doing is holding that $6 million up in the administrative department, actually in Lisa's department. And then as the year emerges and we see where our true needs are, then we can allocate those out to the departments. But what it does is it gives us a little bit more control over where those dollars are spent and allocated. Sources, it's important to point out that this is just the operating portion. So when you see I have a new number, $151 million for municipal wastewater charges, That does not include SAC, and that also does not include the debt service portion of our MWCs. But as you can see, we are fee for service. In fact, everything here, that is the majority of our funds are the state allocations there are pass-throughs. The other is mostly interest, income, and rent. And then the use of reserves is the final piece. That is mostly a result of, in 2017, we operated under a surplus. And so anytime we have a surplus, we try to return that money as quickly as we can to our shareholders, to our ratepayers, excuse me. And that is the use of reserves there that you see that keeps our rates low. Moving on to our overall debt profile. The most exciting thing here to show is that in 2018, we'll have 1.32 billion outstanding, and you can see that is the peak. That number is going to be coming down over time. That's primarily driven by our debt bubble that is going to be with us until about 2021 or 2022. Most of that was from debt smoothing that we did back during the recession to keep our rates minimal. So this is primarily principal payoff, which helps to lower our overall debt burden. But in general, you can see we're going to peak at 1.3 billion and then bring it slowly down into line. That also then will allow our overall debt service to flatten out to about inflation. And then, but 1.3 billion, is that a lot? Relative to our peer agencies, it is absolutely not a lot. We are at the lower end of debt per capita. This is primarily driven by one, stewardship of our fiscal resources, but also the fortunate nature of the Twin Cities in that we have separated stormwater systems. And when you separate your stormwater systems, you don't get consent decrees from the EPA to build underwater tunnels that are 5 miles long at the cost of $5 to $10 billion over 20 years. So when you look at some of the higher areas, particularly Miami comes to mind, Cincinnati is another one that's under consent decree, as well as a few other cities. Those are being financed through debt, and we are fortunate to be in a position where we do not stand subject to consent decrees. And I believe those are the highlights of our budget timeline. Important thing to note is that the council approved our wastewater rates back on the 25th. We've put our preliminary budget presentation here on the 8th. We'll go to adoption on the 22nd. Capital program will be next month, as well as our public comment drafts at the end of October, and then in December we'll have our final votes. And I believe this is council-wide, not just for us.
I think Mary's looking over your shoulder,
Yeah.
saying you're doing her slide.
Council members, on October 22nd, we will ask you to adopt, advance to that next slide. Advance to the next slide. We'll ask you to adopt a preliminary budget of $1.1 billion and set our upper limit on our property tax levy at $87 million, or a 2% increase. And with that, we'll stand for questions.
Any questions, comments?
Madam Chair, just say that the presentations that I've seen before, because I'm on the management committee, I just want to say this is the evolution of this process since I've been here has really been great. The presentations are crisper, cleaner, and I certainly have a better understanding of why the recommendations are coming from staff. So kudos to staff for really putting together a great process, and the recommendations that are coming forward make a lot of sense to me.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. So that concludes the 2 information items. I know we're running a little bit late, so we might want to just see highlights on reports, and I know the regional administrator has one, so I'm calling you.
Okay, great. I'm almost as pleased as the interim director, Erin Koski, to welcome and introduce Sarinthia Jordan. She says we can call her Cy. This is Sarinthia's 3rd day as director of the Office of Equal Opportunity. We're so happy she's here. She's come to us from previously as director of Equal Opportunity in Title IX at Minnesota State University Mankato, and she held positions in equal opportunity and diversity at Minneapolis Public Schools and at the University of Minnesota. and she is experiencing firsthand the tight housing market in the Twin Cities right now. She's preparing to move from Mankato to the Twin Cities, but I am so pleased to have her. She's drinking from the fire hose of getting to know our organization right now, and we just had her sit through a very long budget presentation to be introduced. So thank you so much, Cynthia, or Cy, and we're so pleased to have you here.
Welcome. Any other urgent kind of comments that folks want to make, reports? Okay, seeing none, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second?
Second.